Well, well. Stand aside, Pilus. This one has promise.
Have a care, my lord. She's not like the others.
Do not disappoint me, girl, or I will kill you.
So, Zenos is, like, really cool. Hello, I'm the Salt Exarch, and today we're going to be talking about Zenos Galvus. You've probably read the title by now, and assuming you're not one of the people whose favorite villain in the story so far is already Zenos, I bet you're thinking something like, what a moron! Clearly Emmett Selk, or Nidhogg, or Elidibus, or whoever you like is the best villain. Zenos is garbage. He just wants to murder things for fun. He's just a dick and a stereotypical villain. Well, yes, but actually, no. I mean, he is a dick, and he is pretty villainy as far as Final Fantasy XIV villains go. In general, he's arrogant and uncaring, and his motivations are really self-centered. He's not fighting for his country, he doesn't have an understandable motivation driving him to do all the terrible things he does. He just finds fighting and conflict thrilling, and it's just about the only thing he finds pleasurable. So he wages war and sparks conflict in a hope that it will drive him up against stronger opponents, so he can enjoy the thrill and challenge of crushing them. I know that extended materials go into his backstory and try to paint him in a more sympathetic light, but really the biggest part to take away from those is that he was deprived of a proper childhood, and both doesn't know how to and doesn't care about forming proper connections with other people. If it's trying to set up a sympathetic excuse for why he's a complete monster as an adult, your mileage may vary on if it's successful, but it's definitely a more flimsy excuse than any of the other villains in Final Fantasy XIV, and in my opinion, it definitely doesn't justify his actions. Okay, so far, you've done a good job of explaining that Zenos is a monster with no deep motivation beyond his terrible actions. How does that make him a good villain? Right, so here's the thing. There is a difference between being a sympathetic villain and being a good villain. Oftentimes what endears the audience to a villain is the fact that they are, at least on some level, understandable. And the best way to do that is to give them a sympathetic motivation or a goal that the audience can understand the appeal of, even if they disagree with it. Or at least disagree with the actions taken by the villain in pursuit of that goal. Usually this comes in the form of something we can all understand on some level. Wanting revenge for the death of loved ones, wanting to bring back people we've lost, having a deep-set belief that the world is flawed and wanting to fight to fix it, something the audience can get behind. If you've ever listened to a villain speech and thought, you know, low-key they're making a lot of sense, this is exactly what I'm talking about. Zenos doesn't have this. Sure, you can understand where his love of combat and his self-centered personality comes from. He's been spoiled rotten as a member of the Garlean's royal family and then becomes its heir apparent. He also suffers from anhedonia and only feels pleasure and excitement when engaged in combat. So, from an objective standpoint, you can understand why he does the things he does, but there's no emotional connection there. It's hard to sympathize or agree with a character who does terrible things just because they want to and find it fun. However, having a villain elicit sympathy from the audience is only one way to make a great villain, and it isn't even the only thing you need. You can have a villain with a very sympathetic cause, to the point where the audience might actually wind up agreeing more with them than the hero, and yet, if that villain fails to pose a real and serious threat to the hero, they still won't be a very good villain. A good example of this, and a lot of people are going to get mad at me for saying this, is Ardbert. And no, I don't mean Ghost Ardbert that follows you around during Shadowbringers. I mean this Ardbert, the 3.4 Warrior of Darkness Ardbert. Ardbert and the Warriors of Darkness appear for the briefest of moments. They show up, and almost immediately Ardbert, the leader and counterpart to the Warrior of Light, gets into a fight with Thancred. Now, I'm not saying that Thancred is a pushover by any stretch of the imagination, but this is post-flow magicless Thancred, who's been surviving on the wilderness, versus the leader of the Warriors of Darkness, and they seem to be on pretty even terms. Now, I don't know about you, but by this point in the story, the Warrior of Light just took down a fucking dragon, technically single-handedly, The way the story handles 8-man raids is weird, but canonically there'd be no time or reason for the Warrior of Light to gather their adventurer friends before the final steps of faith. And in the cutscenes both preceding and following Nidhogg's fight, the Warrior of Light is alone. So, at this point, a guy who can't even handedly defeat Thancred is a total joke. The fight with Ardbert and the Warriors of Darkness isn't much better. There are examples of really great fights, both one-on-one and involving multiple enemies, that portray the enemy's presence as a significant threat, and the fight with the Warriors of Darkness is not one of them. So, these villains are really sympathetic, they sacrifice their lives to save their world and all that, but they don't really serve the role of antagonist well. They're never really much of a threat, and they're cast aside about as quickly as they enter the picture. Now, you could argue whether or not this was intentional, but the main thing here, I would say, is working under the assumption that Ardbert is supposed to be a true villain in this patch story, he's not a very effective one. On the flip side, while Zenos isn't necessarily a sympathetic person, he is a fantastic antagonist. He's imposing, and his very presence from the start gives him a threatening presence that tells you he means business. His first act is getting a one-up on the Scions and ambushing the Alamegan Resistance's main camp in Rogger's Reach. He then proceeds to casually stroll across the rampaging battlefield like it's a public park, shrug off all of Lys's attacks, break through Y'shtola's magical barrier with brute strength, and nearly kill her. Then, the Warrior of Light shows up, and he kicks your ass. This scene is hands down the best villain introduction in Final Fantasy XIV. Don't at me. This scene sets up Zenos as a serious threat and hurdle for the Warrior of Light to overcome, and he continues to be an imposing presence. Yugiri, a trained Domin ninja, and one of the best I might add, fails to get the drop on Zenos for an assassination. Zenos kicks hers and the Warriors of Light's asses again, and literally, the next time we see him, he has a perfected form of the Resonant, which we previously saw Fordola using, and he's keeping Shinryu as a pet. As I said in my video about the Echo and the Blessing of Light, Shinryu was a primal so powerful that, instead of having the Warrior of Light fight it like they've done with every other primal in the past, Papalymo thought it best to sacrifice himself just to give the Scions enough time to figure out a way to deal with it. And then the Scions resorted to awakening Omega just to fight the thing one-on-one. And even after Zenos apparently died, he just wound up coming back and eventually regained his old body. So this guy is a pretty big deal, and he might be as hard to kill now as the Ascians. We don't know. Either way, in terms of his role as a serious threat and antagonist, I'd give Zenos a big old check. But it goes even beyond this, and I'll tell you why. Not only is Zenos a really good antagonist, he's also the perfect foil for the Warrior of Light. A foil, if you don't know, is a literary term to describe a character who highlights another character's personality, traits, strengths, and/or weaknesses through their own traits. Zenos is this to a T for the Warrior of Light. Zenos is one of the strongest characters in the entire story of Final Fantasy XIV, and is definitely one of, if not the strongest Garlean we've encountered thus far. In much the same way that the Warrior of Light can be considered the champion of Eorzea due to their strength, Zenos is definitely one of Garlemald's biggest assets. Furthermore, during the events of Stormblood, Zenos obtains the Resonant, an artificial version of the Echo that gives Zenos similar powers to the Warrior of Light. However, the way Zenos uses it is a direct contrast to the way the Warrior of Light does. While the Warrior of Light typically uses the Echo to combat primals and defend Eorzea, Zenos instead uses the Resonant to control primals to be used as weapons. However, the biggest example of this is Zenos' attitude about his personal relationships, life in general, and the challenge of battle. As I mentioned before, Zenos is almost incapable of forming proper relationships with other people, and he doesn't really see the value of this. In contrast, the Warrior of Light often derives their strength through defending and being supported by those around them. Zenos sees life as worthless. It doesn't have a value in and of itself, and only has value in his eyes if it can serve his main goal of finding challenging opponents and defeating them for fun. Zenos doesn't love or hate killing, but he's willing to kill if he needs to, and if it aids his goals. The Warrior of Light, on the other hand, is constantly seen going out of their way to defend the lives of those around them, even at the risk or cost of their own. When people around them do die, they often seem rather distraught, even when those people were previously their enemies. Finally, we have Zenos' philosophy on battle and challenge. Fighting is pretty much the only thing that Zenos enjoys in life. He views everything around him as one big game, with the sole purpose of acting as his entertainment. He spends his days doing whatever it takes to put him in conflict with people who will pose him a challenge, or otherwise making enemies so they will grow strong enough to face him and provide him a challenge. Rather than being a foil to the Warrior of Light, this is a direct foil to you as the player character. Now, this gets a bit meta, and obviously there are a bunch of different people who play the game for different reasons, but assuming the average player with a moderate interest in the game's story and an emotional investment with the characters of that story, this acts as a contrast between Zenos' view of the world as a whole and you, the players. See, Zenos treats the world like a game, which, for us, it is. But despite the fact that this game and its world literally only exist for our entertainment and personal enjoyment, the exact way Zenos acts like the world does from his point of view, most of us still value the world of the game and the characters in it. We could treat the world like Zenos does, and I'm sure a bunch of people do, where the story and the characters, and even the world itself, doesn't really matter. It's only a framing tool to pit us against strong challenges we get enjoyment from completing. But I'd wager that most of us see the world of Final Fantasy XIV as more than that. We're invested in the story and genuinely care about the characters. Why do you think so many people still mourn Harushafan? He was a genuinely likable character who became our friend through our repeated interactions with him. This gives us a brilliant contrast. Us, the players, people who, despite existing outside the world of the game, genuinely care about it and its people, versus Zenos, a person who lives within the world as his reality, but couldn't care less about it or the people around him outside of combat. And just like us as the player, if Zenos goes down, he can get back up. Other villains might have more interesting characters, or might have been a more intimidating threat, but Zenos is the best contrast for both the Warrior of Light and us as the player. And that's why I think he's the best villain. Unless they do something really dumb with him, or introduce someone way cooler later on and I change my mind. This is the risk of making videos on an ever-changing story in an MMO. You never know when everything you said will be completely invalidated. Hooray! But anyway, thank you guys for watching. The editing for this one is going to be a bit more lax, and this was more of a discussion video rather than a proper lore video, so I hope you guys don't mind that so much. Like I said, I'm going to be experimenting around with formats for a bit so I can put out an episode every week, so let me know what you guys think about the video down below. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Like the video if you did, be sure to subscribe if you want more Final Fantasy XIV content from me, and I'll see you all in the next one. Peace out.